Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
It's a thrill to welcome back our next guest. It's been quite a while since he joined us. He's a terrific journalist. He really is. It's a dirty word these days because we don't have any. But he's been investigating serious issues to do with health and much more besides for over 30 years. He's written for LA Weekly, for Nexus, for CBS Health Watch and more. Check out his website, nomorefakenews.com. A real pleasure to welcome back our great friend, John Rappoport. John, welcome back. How are you?
Hi, Richie. Very good, thank you. Very good.
Do you know the fear porn is it's in overdrive, John? Just as we came on air, my news bulletin at the top of the hour talked about outbreaks of Zika in Spain, first pregnancies testing positive. Pilots are being told if you're pregnant, you don't have to go into certain countries. This is absolutely insane. Read your terrific article on your website the other day about this, about microcephaly, and about all of these cases annually of microcephaly in the United States. It seems like this is another massive, I don't want to use the word false flag event, John, but somebody's pulling the wool over somebody's eyes somewhere. What's going on with this story?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of wool, Richie, no question about that. So I've got the latest update from Brazil, which is supposed to be the center of this, quote, epidemic. And these are figures from the Brazilian researchers who have gone back in to check the original work, because all this started with some sort of a claim that there were over 4,000 cases of microcephaly in Brazil, most of them from the northeast sector. And microcephaly means babies born with smaller heads and brain damage, essentially. So that's where the story started. And now the researchers have gone back in to really look at this and see what they can find. And here are the latest figures on this, which are just staggering. They are saying they have now confirmed 404 cases of microcephaly in the whole country of Brazil, with 200 million people. And they also say that they're not positive that these 404 are microcephaly. They might be some other kind of nervous system impairment, but they're going to call them 404 cases. And of those 404, they say that only 17, quote, have a relation to the Zika virus.
Wow.
17, John. Right? So on the basis of this, we have worldwide panic and hysteria. We have women being told not to get pregnant, not to travel to 22 countries, not to breastfeed. And the latest, one of the latest articles up on my site is abortions at sea.
Oh, my God.
Because what's happening in Central and South America, you see, a lot of those countries either don't permit abortion or only under very restrictive conditions. So women in early pregnancy are being told by a group down there that they'll be taken outside the 3-mile limit into international waters on a boat, and they'll be given drugs that will abort their baby. And these women, of course, have no idea of the actual figures here that I've just reported. They have no idea that this whole thing is a gigantic hoax. And so they're losing their children. They're coming back from the ship without being pregnant. And all of this is being, just ripped into the press. The World Health Organization readily admits that they can't demonstrate a connection between microcephaly and the Zika virus, but based on suspicion, they feel that they must take action, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, I've also discovered that every year in the U.S., there are 25,000 cases of microcephaly. That's not just once, that's every year. And nobody utters a peep about that. And in fact, in the literature, it's very clear that any insult to the fetal brain during pregnancy, any insult can cause microcephaly. The woman falls downstairs. She receives a blow in the stomach. she's taking a toxic street drug or medical drug or toxic vaccine, or she's poisoned by a pesticide or anything that would produce what scientists like to call an insult, meaning an injury to the early fetal brain, can cause microcephaly. And the Zika virus, which was discovered in 1947, has never caused anything beyond very mild illness, no treatment, just lie around and it'll go away. And now all of a sudden we receive this hype about it causing brain damage in smaller heads and babies.
Your article, John, sorry to interrupt you, your article was outstanding. It was shared all over the place. I saw it on davidicke.com/headlines. And I want to back John up now before I get out of John's way and he tells us more about this, because only in the last couple of hours, and I have to say this, John, yet again, you are days ahead of the mainstream media. There's a Wall Street Journal published this only a couple of hours ago. There's a number of Brazilian newborns with a rare birth disorder, as the World Health Organization suspects is linked to the Zika virus, may be lower than earlier feared, Health Ministry data show. And this is brilliant, this. Further complicating matters, it is unclear how many cases of microcephaly occurred in Brazil before the arrival of Zika, as it wasn't mandatory to report microcephaly to a national registry until late last year. And the Wall Street Journal confirms what you told us in your article, which I think was on Monday, wasn't it? Monday. We saw your article on No More Fake News. Microcephaly has dozens of triggers, experts say, and without knowing the prevalence of microcephaly before Zika, it's hard to gauge the virus's role in current rates of the birth defect. Outstanding journalism, John. Outstanding by you, by the way. You're being copied now by the Wall Street Journal. So, what's really going on here? What's really going on?
Well, let me just add one more figure to this, one more piece of this puzzle. People have to understand that when the World Health Organization starts to hype, quote, numbers of cases, and this is spreading all over the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what they're really trying to say is that the Zika virus is showing up in different places around the world, you see. The virus that hasn't been proved to cause anything is spreading around the world. Well, the virus was discovered in 1947. That doesn't mean that it just popped into existence. It might have existed on this planet for 100,000 years. I mean, who knows? And because it doesn't really cause anything, so it's traveled around the world a few thousand times and all kinds of people have it, and it doesn't mean anything. Because 99% of viruses do nothing. They just hang around. There's millions upon millions of viruses. So what, you see? But that's how they leverage the story, because this gives them, the Zika virus gives them the opportunity to say that there will be 1 million cases or 3 million cases around the world or whatever the hell they want to say. But what they really mean is that on some kind of a test, somebody would test positive for Zika, a virus that doesn't cause anything. You see, that's what they leave out. So they can give people the fear factor and the, fear porn, and they can spread this message and people will buy it because they think it actually means something and it doesn't mean anything. So what's really going on here, first of all, is Brazil is the biggest user of pesticides in the world. And that's a very significant fact because, there's a lot of countries in the world and Brazil is number one. We're talking about Monsanto and Roundup. We're talking about atrazine, which I've already written about. And there's a study that links atrazine to causing microcephaly. And there are many other pesticides that are being used in Brazil that are banned in 22 other countries because they're that tough. So we're talking about a country which has enormous amounts of poverty, lack of basic sanitation, generation to generation severe malnutrition, overcrowding, et cetera, right? Which makes it just a bed that's open to any kind of disease because people's immune systems are destroyed. And now you introduce these gigantic corporate pesticides, which are clearly poisonous, and you have a formula for multiple kinds of destruction of human life. That's what you've got. So the Zika virus becomes, and I hope people can get this, the ideal cover story. The virus, quote, the virus is the greatest cover story ever invented, because now people can say, well, I'm sorry that all these people are dying. We don't know. It's got to be the virus, and we have no control over that. And the researchers are working as hard as they can to develop a vaccine, blah, 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 blah. And the attention is taken away from what's really going on, you see, which is the poisoning of an entire country with tonnage of toxic pesticides.
And the whoring corporate media don't investigate it, are told not to investigate it, or have no interest in investigating it. Isn't it amazing about glyphosate? MIT professor Stephanie Seneff was on the programme last week linking glyphosate Roundup to all manner of problems. Now, Stephanie is not a doctor, but she's a number cruncher. She's a computer scientist and an artificial intelligence expert and crunches data. And the amount of illnesses that she's linking glyphosate to, this is incredible, John. This is doing untold damage to people, this particular compound. And you're saying this is a cover story. I'm going to read a couple of tweets out to you. Polly was on to say, could it be forced vaccinations during the first trimester? Has Brazil been selected as visitors worldwide are about to descend, she asks. Chris was on to say, let John know we're getting his work out as much as possible. Stephen was on to say, Richie, can you ask John if he thinks the Zika virus propaganda will intensify or will ultimately be exposed as a fraud? Well, you've exposed it, John, and we have the Wall Street Journal today saying that, they're taking a couple of steps back on the evidence that this virus might be causing microcephaly. Do you think they might have taken a step too far this time? And do you think they're going to be exposed on this particular issue?
Well, there's always a chance that it could happen, but from my past experience, once the genie is out of the bottle, they never turn back. Because if they did, you see, it's like the boy who cried wolf. Well, we said there were all these cases, but really there weren't. Yeah, they're going to say that. And we said that the virus was causing the case, but that's not really true. We have no evidence for that either. So, okay, we goofed. No. If they, the Wall Street Journal article is a good example. When they take a step back, they take a step back. And they use all kinds of words like may, could be, possibility of, they hedge their bets so that most readers don't really get the fact that the liars and the criminals really started this whole propaganda campaign. And that really never comes out. It's never fully exposed. And I know of a case, and I'm not sure that you and I ever discussed it, but it had to do with Cheryl Atkinson, who was the investigative reporter at CBS News, who eventually left, and her computers were being hacked and all kinds of stuff was going on. But she exposed the swine flu hoax in the fall of 2009. And that article was, in fact, published on the CBS News website. And then her editor, who was, very much in favor of the story, tried to get it on the network nightly news television, and it was just completely shut down. And from that point on, CBS never touched the whole story. So the idea that somebody's going to back away, a media outlet is really going to say. In fact, I was interviewed this morning by a guy named John Levine at Mike.com, MIC.com, which is, it's a big website, I guess, and they do news for, quote, millennials, and I guess they have a big audience. And once I realized that he was actually trying to interview me and that we weren't really just chatting, I said, okay, so let me give you an earful about the Zika virus and microcephaly. And I ran down the numbers that I just gave you here. And, I just went on. And I said, this is a hoax. This is a hoax. And my impression, and just my opinion, was at the end of all this, he's not going to run with the story. And he knows that if he went on an all-out attack against the World Health Organization, that his reputation would be, stained indelibly, and that he would have a lot of trouble from this point on. So even, most people are just not willing to take the wood to people who are the liars. So I wouldn't expect that they're really going to, what they could do is they could say 3 months from now, due to the heroic efforts of public health officials and authorities and prevention and this and that and the other thing, we are seeing fewer cases now, et cetera, and then let the whole thing die out because they've done that before. But they admit no wrongdoing in the process.
It's incredible. A load of people on Twitter. This has gone viral on Twitter right now. People asking questions about the Rockefellers and people buying the vaccine for research, and a lot of people doing their own research after reading John's story earlier in the week on nomorefakenews.com and finding out that, yes, this Zika virus is pretty harmless. It causes mild discomfort and it eventually just goes away if left alone. I want to read a question from Sean. This is an email question. Richie, does John think that the 70-year-old Rockefeller Zika virus plus Bill Gates's GMO mosquitoes are all part of the elite's secret weapons for quiet wars against humanity? And what he might be getting at in terms of quiet wars against humanity, going after birth control, trying to prevent people from conceiving, trying to prevent women from conceiving. Is that why we're seeing all of these scares in third world countries about Zika? What do you think, John?
Okay, so let me break this down, and I'll answer another question that was asked as well. First of all, we've got what I call now depopulation by press conference, because there's no science, just women are being warned not to get pregnant, not to travel to these countries, not to breastfeed, and we've got abortions at sea. And so there's all this hysteria is going to prevent lots of women from, getting pregnant and having children. Just that by itself, okay? Now, somebody mentioned a vaccine in an earlier question. What they're talking about is the Tdap vaccine, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis. And it's true that in 2014 in Brazil, they started recommending this vaccine for women, and maybe it was even pregnant women. I'd have to go back and check that. So the thing is here, yes, all vaccines are toxic. All vaccines are damaging. I mean, I've run this down hundreds of times in articles and talks and so on and so forth. They contain toxic chemicals. They contain germs they're not even supposed to have in the vaccine. And yes, there's always an opportunity to stick something in the vaccine that really doesn't belong there and is really toxic. And we've had episodes of that as well. But to say that the vaccine is causing microcephaly, you see, people are getting off on a different track here, because you have to go back to the beginning and say, how many cases really are there in Brazil? Go back to the beginning, folks, because so far they're only saying they have confirmed, they think, 404 cases in the whole country.
Massive country, by the way.
200 million people, right? Yeah. So there's that. But yes, of course, the vaccine can cause tremendous damage. And then when it comes to the genetically engineered mosquitoes, there have been test projects of releasing those mosquitoes in Brazil. And they're supposed to be killing other mosquitoes that carry dengue fever. Okay. So the company that is researching and making these genetically engineered mosquitoes is called Oxitec. And yes, they have received $1 billion in funding from Bill Gates, indeed. So sure, that is suspicious right off the bat. And no health studies were done in any of the places in the world where these mosquitoes have been released up front to see, what are the effects? What could happen? We don't need to know about that, just like they didn't need to know about science when they released GMO crops that have proved to be a complete disaster. So it's the same deal. No, we don't need to do any studies. Everything's fine. We're just going to release the mosquitoes. So one conceivable outcome here is that these mosquitoes do, in fact, kill a whole bunch of these other mosquitoes that carry dengue fever, which creates a vacuum. And then another kind of mosquito, for example, the Asian tiger, fills the gap. They are also dengue carriers, and they breed more quickly than the other dengue mosquitoes that have been killed. That's just one possible bad outcome. There's all kinds of bad outcomes. And who can say, really, I certainly can't, what actually is being carried by these genetically engineered mosquitoes? I can't give you a whole list of everything that's there or what it can do or what may have been secretly implanted in these mosquitoes. Absolutely not. This is a major, major thing and a major, major risk. But again, to try to tie this to the incredible outbreak of microcephaly, hold on, folks, go back to the beginning. How many cases really have been confirmed in Brazil? 400 cases in the whole country, they think. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
This is the important thing. And I've been around this rodeo so many times since 1987 on these phony epidemics. So, I've learned through trial and error the kinds of questions you have to ask. Whenever one of these things breaks out, the first thing you have to say is, show me the actual number of cases of whatever this is supposed to be. Show me, and show me how you got there and decided that. I don't want propaganda. I want, the science. Where is it? And then this thing that you say causes this condition, which inevitably turns out to be a virus, show me how you got there too. Show me. And when you start asking those, impertinent questions, most of the time what you find, in fact, in every case that I've ever investigated, it's all a hoax. It's all a hoax. If there are large numbers of people dying, they're dying from something else. Like, for example, in Africa. Go into any number of places in Africa, and again, severe, generation to generation starvation and severe malnutrition, no sanitation, sewage pumped directly into the water supply, vast overcrowding, land, good land, farming land stolen by major corporations and governments. Go down the list. Vaccine campaigns that become incredibly toxic when someone's immune system is already on the edge of failure. You just add all of these things, contaminated water supplies. Well, the fact is that the local governments and the globalists with their major mega corporations who go in there to plunder and pillage want to keep things that way in these countries, including parts of Brazil. They want that horrendous situation to remain that way. And, of course, add in the pesticides, too. They don't want to cure this or change it in any way because it gives them more control over the country. The people can't fight back. The people will go to work for slave wages for the major corporations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what do these globalist, maniacs and criminals need? Above all, they need a cover story. They need to explain away all of this that they are perpetuating and maintaining in these countries. And so they have come up with the ideal medical cover story. The virus is doing it. It's not just Zika. You can track this down in several cases of key so-called epidemics and find the same pattern.
You're right. Thing. Swine flu being another typical example of this. It's interesting you talk about the mega corporations. I saw an interview with Paul Bulke, the Belgian guy who's now running Nestle, on CNN the other day, and he was talking about the wonderful opportunities in the next decade for Nestle in agriculture in Africa. And it's almost like listening to the devil incarnate talking, because you know exactly what that means for Africa. It means exploitation, as you said quite rightly there, the plundering of assets belonging to that country, forcing people into slave labour. It's absolute terror is what it is. I have to ask you about this, John, while we have you on. By the way, go to John's website, nomorefakenews.com. It's 19 minutes to the top of the hour. You will be aware of this. A payout. Narcolepsy boy wins £120,000 over swine flu vaccine damage. That was a big BBC story this week. The young boy, Josh Hadfield, was 10 when he was given the Pandemrix swine flu vaccine when he was 4. Heaven knows why his parents thought that was a good idea. But anyway, I'm not going to hammer his parents. They're going through very difficult times with the boy. He's developed narcolepsy. The government didn't want to give him any money. They said he wasn't disabled enough. But a court ruled he was and awarded him £120,000 through the Vaccine Damage Payments Scheme. They said that he did have severe disability. What does that story tell you, John?
Okay, well, You see, the real danger in the swine flu epidemic that was not an epidemic was the vaccine. The vaccine was toxic, is toxic. Very, very dangerous, what we're talking about. So just look at this straight on. What is the situation that we're looking at here? We're looking at a situation with a non-epidemic for which there is a toxic vaccine. What does that tell you? You know, that tells you a tremendous amount of human destruction based on nothing, based on a lie, based on a huge lie about an epidemic. And as I referred to that Cheryl Atkinson story earlier in the conversation, what she discovered essentially was in the summer of 2009, when swine flu was supposed to be at its peak, the Centers for Disease Control in America actually stopped counting cases of swine flu. Now, you have to understand that's their job. That's what they do. They issue reports every week on all kinds of different conditions and diseases, and they keep track, or they're supposed to, of these case numbers, and they actually just stopped counting. And so she decided to find out why. And what she discovered was, and this was the blockbuster, and it was published on the CBS News website, the overwhelming majority of blood samples from diagnosed swine flu patients, or the most likely swine flu patients, that were sent to labs, all those blood samples overwhelmingly came back with no trace of swine flu or any flu whatsoever. So there they were, the CDC, totally caught with their pants down, talking about thousands and thousands of cases of swine flu in America. They had stopped counting, and all the tests showed that this was a whole hoax, that the overwhelming majority of these people, when they actually had their blood tested, showed no trace of any kind of flu, including swine flu. Okay? And that's the story that was published, and that's the story that was shot down and never shown on the nightly news. And this was my piece, 3 weeks or so later, the CDC decided to double down and triple down and tell a really gigantic lie. And this ranks up among the biggest lies of that agency, which lies all the time. They said, in their estimation, there were, get this, 22 million cases of swine flu in America.
Jesus.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, this is like only a person with extreme, I mean, I don't know even what to call it. You would have to be a complete idiot to believe that. And they floated that lie, and it went by unnoticed, and nobody said anything in the press about it. And, so the whole thing was a non-epidemic from the beginning. Okay? That's what it was. And I could go into chapter and verse about La Gloria, Mexico, and the pig farm down there where they first said it started and whatever, and the horrendous conditions there and the chemical spraying and all that. But, you get the picture. So on top of that, they come up with a vaccine that's extremely dangerous and just destroys lives. I mean, is there a prison big enough for all these people? But they will never go to prison.
No, well, not in the short term, John. Maybe in the long term. Ailco is listening to the programme in Holland, asks a good question. I think when you were on with us the first time, I think you were asked this same question. What is your opinion on AIDS and the Ebola virus even, being created in a laboratory by scientists, by us? What were they? Were AIDS and Ebola created by us?
Yeah, okay, well, I've addressed this somewhat before. It's not a pleasant subject, but again, you have to go back to the beginning, okay? Now, I wrote a book in 1988 called AIDS Inc., and that was my first book, and the whole purpose of that book essentially was to prove that HIV, there was no evidence whatsoever that HIV was causing anything that was being called AIDS or anything else, period, okay? And it would take me several hours to run down all of that evidence, but it was there. This was no science whatsoever. And in the case of Ebola, I interviewed a very good scientist with the question, have they ever isolated the Ebola virus from a human being? In other words, have they ever really removed tissue from a human being and identified it specifically as Ebola correctly? And he did a literature search, as much literature as he could possibly find, and he sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the CDC asking them for evidence of where it had ever been isolated from a human being. And nowhere in any of this did he find any convincing evidence that that virus had ever been isolated from a human being, period. And that means that the entire episode, to say the least, the Ebola episode, is thrown into incredible doubt as to what really was making those people sick and die. And I wrote, I don't know, maybe a dozen articles at the time on Ebola, the last go around, and indicated all of the other reasons why people were getting sick in those countries and why the travelers who came back were being diagnosed and all of that. And none of it had to do with the virus. So you see, to start asking the question, was the HIV virus made in a lab? Was the Ebola virus made in a lab? You have to go back to the beginning and say, is there any evidence that these viruses ever caused anything to begin with? Or in the case of Ebola, for example, and HIV, that's another story, that they actually have ever been isolated and looked at and identified to begin with. Those are the ground basic questions you have to ask first. So in reply to the question, I would say, well, if these viruses actually exist and they were made in a lab, they certainly were duds. They turned out to be absolutely useless for the purpose for which they were designed. And that is a very long story, but I boiled it down, and I wish more people would understand that. Because you see, here's the mind control. And again, I really wish people would understand that. Here's the initial piece of mind control. An announcement is made of an outbreak. Following that, announcement is made of the virus that causes the outbreak. Now, all manner of researchers climb on that train right now, including researchers that are not in the mainstream. They climb on that train and they buy that story, that piece of mind control right at the beginning. And now they some of them begin to try to figure out, well, where did the virus really come from? Or, what is really, but they're basically buying the piece of initial mind control and getting on that train. And everything after that is going to be distorted if you don't go back to the beginning and ask the two fundamental questions that I've mentioned and repeated here. You've got to do that. And that is not being done because there is this impulse to buy the initial story. And look at it on a larger level. Any propaganda covert op works this way. In for a penny, in for a pound. If you buy the initial fairy tale and the initial myth, you're sold, you see. Now on the back end, they can sell you anything they want to because you bought the first product. Or if you decide, okay, well, I bought the first product, but, I really think it was made in a lab or this or that or the other thing, you're still buying the first product when you have to question, should I really have bought the initial piece of propaganda in this operation? And that goes for any operation. I mean, anything, where it's basically all about propaganda. You have to stop at the very beginning and say, do I want to get on this train at all or not?
The essence of problem, reaction, solution, isn't it? It's the very essence of it. What you've
yes, you can look
there,
at it that way too. Yes.
Yeah, it's 9 minutes to the top of the hour. John's going to go in a minute because he's got another one of these to do just after the top of the hour. By the way, the book he mentioned, he was on the program talking about this early last year. It's AIDS Inc. Scandal of the Century, and you can find it at all good online book retailers. I've seen it on amazon.co.uk. That's AIDS Inc. Scandal of the Century, and go to nomorefakenews.com. John, what advice do you want to leave people with seeing these stories on Sky News, on Fox News, on CNN, all of these stories. I mean, even though the Wall Street Journal has basically followed your lead in saying that all the evidence is pointing to the fact that the Zika virus isn't doing the damage that we're being told, that won't matter. The machine will go forward anyway. People listening to this now, hearing all these stories, what's your advice to them before we part company today?
Well, the advice I've already given, plus just understand that when you see somebody in the press, I don't care who they are, anchor on the news, reporter, writing in a newspaper, whatever, mainstream press we're talking about, or the, quote, medical experts that are talking on the talk shows and so forth and so on, they know nothing. They have no firsthand knowledge of anything that they're talking about. They're taking their cues from other people who are taking their cues from other people and so on and so forth. Just understand that. Their job and the reason they pick up their paychecks is because they sound like they know what they're talking about. They sound convincing. That's why they are making a living. That's their job. But actually, they know nothing. That's what you have to understand. And if you understand that, then you can really back up from the whole thing and say, well, I'm looking at a stage play here. And these are the actors, and these are the roles, and this is what they say. This is the script. Okay, I understand now. Fine. All right. So I can laugh at it, or I can weep at it, or whatever I want to do. But I understand that fundamentally, these people do not know anything about what they're talking about. And I've gotten in reporters' faces about this before. You know, just said, look, I know that you know nothing. You know, you can BS me all you want, but you're just giving me cues that other people have given you. And you sitting there know nothing. Zero. And that's what you have to do when you approach these people. Be relentless. Be relentless, and you will see that you win, not lose.
John, it was a pleasure talking to you again. Thanks for coming back on the programme.
Hey,
continued
Richie,
success
it's
to you.
always good to be here with you. Thank you
it's
so
brilliant,
much
my
for
friend.
the invitation.
And you're a gentleman. People, go to nomorefakenews.com. John, that was an outstanding bit of journalism this week, my friend, in a world where it's very scarce indeed. Look after yourself. Talk again real soon.
Okay, Richie, thanks again.
Marvellous. John Rappoport on the line to us there from his home. It's 6 minutes to the top of the hour, 5 minutes to the top of the hour now. Loads of tweets on that, loads of comments. Martin was on to say an epidemic is a small number of people, 15 cases per 100,000 people for 2 consecutive weeks. Isn't that extraordinary? And it's also true. Marco was on to say, we're all screwed, Richie, man. We're not, Marco. We're not, because more and more people are coming alive to what's going on a daily basis. As the agenda proceeds and becomes more apparent, more and more people are waking up to it and are saying, we've had enough. I really believe that. Paul was on to say, could the same be said about climate change being a cover story? Absolutely, Paul, no doubt about that. And just want to say out to Chris as well, to Alex, and to Anne, to everybody else is tweeting in on this particular issue.